Be present and don't meet the moment with your pat answer. I mean, if you're presenting yourself as a generic brand of whatever, where am I going to discern value in that?
Right.
So go into every situation thinking, how am I going to demonstrate my ability to add value to this institution? That should be the basis or the anchor of how you show up.
At Mekanism, we build iconic brands with soul and science. The soul is culturally relevant brand building, and the science is the always-on marketing activities that drive the bottom line. Learn more at Mekanism.com. What makes up a company? Companies really are just a collection of people and how they all work together. And how are they working together to build a company and themselves? And how can you as a leader know when to inject your team with fresh ideas and fresh direction? On this episode of the Soul and Science podcast, we're sitting down with Jackie Welch, Chief Human Resource Officer of the New York Times, to get the inside scoop on the benefits of a strong employer brand and how to build one. In her role at the Times, she leads the organization's human resources team and oversees all aspects of talent acquisition, career development, organizational development, equitable compensation practices, performance enablement, and DE&I. In this episode, you'll learn how to build a strong team of talent with a solid mission that moves everyone toward a common goal. You'll learn about the place where internal and external branding overlap, and you'll learn about the crucial role of HR during a time of crisis. Okay, let's dive in and learn about the soul and science of talent with Jackie Welch. So, Jackie, let's start, before we get into the New York Times and your role there, let's talk about your origin story. I always love a good origin story. How did you end up where you are today?
There's a lot to the origin story. So what I will tell you is I definitely think when it comes to careers, some people fall into their careers and some people are called to their careers. And I definitely feel like I was called into my career. I started off with a very, very specific view of myself as a physician. And when I say specific, like I imagined that I would live and work in a small town. I would carry a black bag. I would make house calls, which now, all these years later, just strikes me as completely hilarious because there were no physicians at that time in my family. So I didn't have that as a reference point. And there wasn't even Dr. Quinn Medicine Woman on TV. So where this very vivid imagination of my life came from is still a mystery. But to make a long story short, I went to school as a pre-med major, had what I would consider a early midlife crisis and realized like medicine's not for me because it was far more commercial than I really understood. Changed my major, became an English major because I like words, I like reading, and why not after getting good counsel from my parents. And actually started my career in retail. I was a merchant with Lord & Taylor, a then division of the May Department Stores Company. And then went on and consulted for a number of years with two global brands. So it was 10 years out of school before I landed in HR. And there was a very specific moment as an undergraduate student. I was doing a co-op at a local nonprofit that really focused on getting local residents job ready. And the very first person I placed into a job after he'd completed his probation period came back to the office, open-faced crying, to thank me for giving him a way to provide for his family. And that's when I got the call. And I was like, I want to be in personnel, because back then it was personnel. And that changed everything in terms of what I wanted to do as my life's work.
Would you say when you were younger, the idea of being a doctor in a small town was your idea of helping people? You thought that would be a way to like help a community, and it ended up that when you had that sort of moment of clarity, it was because you were helping someone and you're like, oh, that's now my calling. Do you think it was the same thing, or do you feel like being a doctor was sort of the pinnacle of like career, or that's like, was a high bar?
It's such a delicious and nuanced question. And just by the way that you've phrased it, you're romantic. I wish it were that romantic. I wish I could like comport to the way that you just laid it out. And it's hard, all these years later to know precisely like what the dials were. But what I can tell you as part of the origin story, I am the child of immigrants. And I grew up working class. Those two things don't always travel together, but they did in my case. And in my immigrant family, success was doctor, lawyer, accountant, teacher, marry one. And so to your point, I think doctor was just one of a very few number of choices that would really signal that I had made good on all the things that my parents invested in me in terms of their choices to come to this country and have me here and blah 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 blah. But now with some distance, there, I can pretty credibly draw a line between the work I do now and my ambitions to be a doctor. There is the connectivity around helping people. And so now I help people differently. So maybe, but I think I probably came to that as opposed to that being the impetus for these decisions.
What are you particularly good at, do you think? We all have different skills
Hmm.
that we develop. And it's hard to talk about yourself this way, but what do you think your particular skill is that makes you very successful in your job?
I will say curiosity. I mean, that's become a thing that people talk about a lot now, but I'm still in an abiding relationship with my first grade teacher. And um, one of the things that she said to me once I became an adult was, "You were one of the most curious students I've ever had." And it wasn't curiosity like, I know the answer, but I want to demonstrate I'm so smart because I'm going to ask this question, but like literally, well, why? But why? But why? And that has always been my go to in terms of how to enter into conversation, into relationship. And I'm not afraid to not know. Right? Every expert started off as someone that didn't know, but loved and had a passion for a thing enough to become smart. And now we regard them as an expert. So I've never had any inhibition around, I don't know the answer to that question, but I'll go find out.
How long have you been at the Times?
It'll be 4 years in January. So I am your quintessential COVID hire. I was here 6 months before I'd met anyone other than my boss, which was a surreal, I still don't know that I've fully processed what that was like, taking on a big, enormous job in that context. But it'll be 4 years in January.
And when you got the call for the Times, was that like, oh, this is something I really have to take seriously? It's the New York Times, because so much weight to it. It's such a cornerstone of our fabric.
It's important to say that my relationship to the Gray Lady is not particularly unique. Any number of my colleagues walking around the building will have a similar story, but I quite literally have been reading the paper since I'm 10 years old. Like, learned how to fold it just so you could strap hang safely, which is a reference that kids today will be like, strap hang, what does that even mean? But I'm that old, right? So on the subway with my paper and coming from an immigrant family, the Times in many ways was the sort of the guide of like, what is this country? What are the politics? What is the culture? And so it's an artifact. It's an artifact to my becoming an adult. So to work here and to answer your very specific question, I always take calls from search professionals, not because I'm always on the prowl for something, but I do believe in the economy of sometimes you're just a pass through. And there are any number of people that I've connected to opportunities simply because I picked up the phone and said, have you thought of so and so? And when I got this call, Jason Hanold, if he ever hears this, shout out to Jason. Um, Jason Hanold called me and, said the New York Times. And I will say this now, for me, it was like, and where do I sign? What's the question?
I could start on Monday.
Mm-hmm. And that's important to say because I was at Freddie Mac and I had no plans to leave Freddie Mac. Like, I don't know that I was going to stay there till I died or retired, but there was no push. And, and we'll get into this, at this age and stage in my career and in my life, the ability to have my values permeate everything about me gets higher and higher. And so at Freddie Mac, I took great pride in saying I work for a company that makes home possible. I remember moving into our family home and the difference that made for everybody, economically, socially, the whole deal. So there was no reason to leave. So, and I wish that for everyone, if you're making these choices that they're not out of duress, it's because it's for you to have an expression of your skills and your talents and ambition uh, in a context that's more deeply aligned to who you are as a person, who you were becoming. So that was the Times value proposition for me. Like, how do you not want to work for an institution that defends freedom of the press and keeps people informed?
All right. Well, today we're talking about building a strong team, which is foundational for even if you have a powerful brand that stands for something in the fabric of society, you still are always having to build the strongest team you can to propel and continue success. How do you think about ensuring that there's top tier talent at the New York Times, and how do you nurture that talent?
It's such a great nuanced question. There are a couple of things I would say. Um, it comes down to culture in my mind. Like everything I say from this point forward will have a place under culture. And so, here at the Times, this idea of being part of an institution that's old enough to have covered the Civil War, for example, that's very much tied to and invested in the preservation of a free press. Um, I think that speaks to working here speaks to people's genuine desire to be part of something that's had a history that predates them and will continue on long after they depart, right? And so for every organization, it's to find like what's your value proposition beyond the obligations of returning value to the shareholder, right? Because this is a for-profit institution.
For sure.
So beyond the very important objective of returning shareholder value, there's this question for what does this institution do? What's the mark that this institution is going to make? And what's our ability to communicate that to the people who already work here and the people who endeavor to work here? And then moreover, what are your practices? What are your tools to ensure that there is as much value alignment as is possible? Right? My pattern recognition tells me that performance starts to dip when the values start to separate. When people aren't intrinsically motivated to do their best work because they believe in what the institution is doing, that often begins a spiral of ineffectiveness, or the institution starts to lose confidence in the person. If you dig deeply enough, you'll see that it's oftentimes not anything to do with ability. It has everything to do with will. And that will is tied to, I just don't feel like this is a place where I can do the best work.
Hmm.
And so culture to me is really the unlock to all of those things.
And the bedrock of culture sounds like it's values.
No, for sure. For
Yeah.
sure. And they're very practical ways. I mean, it would be difficult, I think, to find an organization that didn't say we have values. And you go into most brick and mortar institutions and they're probably plastered on the walls somewhere where,
Yeah.
you know, they're visible. And the question then becomes the degree to which you live the values. And so as one practical example here at the Times, it's a made up word, I'm aware, but we behaviorized our values, right? So in our performance evaluation process, we actually ask the question, is this individual comporting themselves in a way that's in alignment with our values? And it's a pass fail question, right? And the intention is to provide very direct feedback on, here's an example of where you did or did not comport to the values of the institution. And to complete the circle, because all talent practices should be thought of, I think, as an ecosystem. So even at the front end of the interview process, the values are now part of what we, for lack of a better word, test for, right? So independence is huge, and we talk about the fact, like, what happens if we print a story that you don't agree with? What's the impact of your ability to continue to work here and do your best work? Like, so before you even walk in the door, here are our values, and now let's have a real, transparent, and candid conversation about your ability to comport to those values. So yeah, values, extremely important.
Interestingly enough, next week I'm going to all four of our offices to roll out updated values. I don't know if you think about it, but for me, if your culture needs a little reigniting, which ours does at this time, I think it's important, not frequently, every once in a while to re-examine those values and see if they have to be tweaked based on the performance that you're trying to drive and the culture you're trying to create. And we haven't changed our values until now, since we started the company. So I hope it works, but we're,
It's a great I mean, I think it's such an important point you're making in that you can be in institutions where you continue your practices out of habit. And I think every practice, you decide, like, what the schedule of maintenance is, but just as a matter of good hygiene, we should ask the question, "We built it in this set of circumstances, things have changed. Are they durable enough that we say they're fine? Do we have to make changes around the margins? Or are we taking this down entirely and starting from scratch?" It's a reasonable question. And I think once you have alignment on this is a reasonable thing to do and you make it part and parcel of how you lead your institution, you stave off a lot of trouble later. Because again, we're all going to maintain a relationship to some core things. And that makes dealing with market conditions or we experienced a rise in the need for a certain kind of talent. So we were sort of, but if you have the right tools in place, then it's just a matter of like walking through these challenges, but with the right support systems because you've kept your tools and your processes healthy. So I applaud you. It's good that you're doing that.
Do you think there's a number of values that a brand or a company should have? Do you think it should be 5 to 7? Do you think there's any magic to that?
I don't know. It's a great question. I don't know. I am in some ways a minimalist. I don't necessarily subscribe to more is better. I more am of the mind frame of what's memorable is better. So whatever the number is that you could go to any person in the institution and say, what are our values? That's the number. Right? Like
Can you remember them? And are they memorable and meaningful? That's really the criteria. Yeah.
that really is. And sometimes and to sort of dodge the urge to do the obvious ones, right?
Right.
Like
Sure.
I like to use independence as the example here because most institutions don't have a need to call out independence, but we say do nothing that's going to contaminate the integrity of the journalism, which makes perfect sense then that independence would be one of our values. So now I'm thinking about this real time. I think partly it's what are the values that support who the institution is and what it does. Like that should be the driver of what the values are. And then what's going to be most memorable and sustainable should determine the number.
That's great. What are some innovative strategies that you've employed or you're still working with in talent acquisition to make sure you're attracting that top talent? Very fragmented, highly competitive. There's always some new online something that you're competing with. You're competing with social media platforms as well. How do you make sure that you're getting the talent that you want?
That's another great question. Do you do this for a
That's
living?
that's a hard
Um,
question. I know. But I don't know, maybe there's some things that you've had an outsized impact that you've utilized.
yeah, I mean, so, how outsized is always for someone else to determine, right? Because we can have a sense of, look at this great thing, and other people are like, meh, it was fine. Um, and I'm tend not to focus on what can we do that's brand new or sort of market leading. I'm more of a pragmatist when it comes to these things because it touches people. Like my work literally touches people. And how many times do you want to poke somebody with this new thing? But I mean, at some point you exhaust people. So I am more often than not looking for what's the thing that we can do that accomplishes our objectives and that's sustainable, and that we get people to buy into and not feel burdened by, right? Like it's my work and I don't begrudge it, as opposed to they're making me do this again and I assure you in 6 months it's going to change. So that's sort of the place I come from. So to your question, I really do think, our publisher, A.G. Sulzberger, wrote this amazing treatment of what we mean when we say independence at the times and sort of the implications of the attack on free press globally, et cetera. And one of the things that we've done as part of our talent acquisition effort is you got to read it. Like, we literally are like, go read that. And then we'll talk about scheduling interviews, right? Like, and so for me, that's just a great demonstration of an institution that has the ability to fully articulate this is what we do, and this is why we do it, and this is what we stand by. Being able to communicate that to a candidate and to the people that work for you is underappreciated and undervalued goal. Like, we have no questions about why we're all here, and that then makes the work really, really important, or like we're singularly focused on the right things. So that would be one thing. The other thing is less of a tool and a war process and more of a mindset. I grew up in my career where you would routinely hear someone say, I know a guy who's going to be a perfect fit, which really is an unconscious recommitment to what you already are. So if you say that you're a company that's looking to evolve and to do all these things, do you want someone who fits or do you want someone who adds? And if you go with the latter, then at the word go, you're signing up for a little bit of friction because you're going to hire someone that doesn't necessarily comport themselves or behaves or walks and talks or has the same background as you, but you see their ability to add to what you are and what you endeavor to be. And so to have clarity around that, like, so even in the announcements to say, Jackie's not quite what we've seen before in these ways, and that's why we hired her because we want her to do blah, 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 as opposed to they'll fit right in.
I love this distinction. Really interesting way to think about it. Will they add to what we're building here?
And how will you support them? Because you were deliberately now introducing potentially some friction into the system. So then you got to get behind this person and expect, like, it may not be smooth, but it's going to be worth it.
What do you think are key elements of a strong employer brand? There's obviously the brand on the outside and what the world sees. Then there's brand on the inside and what the employees feel. I don't know if you have any thoughts on the distinction there and how that works.
Yeah, that's another. Yeah, you're really good at this.
No softballs. No softballs.
No softballs, and I like it. That's great. So setting aside that most people have to work, we're not all heirs and heiresses or lottery winners. Like, most people do have to be employed, right? And most institutions need people to do work. So we have supply, we have demand. I think it's incumbent on the institution to have a very clear, and we've talked about some of this already, what is it that we do? Why do we do it? How do we do it? What do we stand for? There's like a punch list of high self-awareness on the part of the institution. And then there's, in my view, sort of standing firmly on those things to say, as we evaluate who comes through the doors to join our team, do we see them adding value to all of these things? Right. And then once the person gets inside the organization, and it's a two-way street. So if that's the obligation of the institution and the obligation of the individual is, what is it that I want to do with my skills, my talents, my ambitions? Because you have choices, right? So when I meet people who are miserable at work, I'm like, well, you should quit and go find something else to do. Like, you don't need to consign yourself to misery or other employers. This is not the place. And so if those are the obligations of the institution, the obligations of the individual are, do I have clarity about what my skills are? Can I articulate how I think I can best utilize my skills in service to? So when I interview people, I'm always like, why this job and why now? And I'm listening very carefully for not a right answer, but for thought. Now I'm giving away my trade secret, but for the thoughtfulness. Like, did you just land here? Which may be okay, but you need to know. You need to know that enough and well enough to communicate to me so I know, like, you're coming in the door because this is a place where you want to invest your time, your efforts, your talents, your skills, your ambitions for the long haul. I have a lot of respect for people who say it's a stepping stone. So now I know likely I'm not going to have you on a succession plan, but If you're saying you're staying here for 2 or 3 years, I got 2 or 3 years worth of things for you to do, but at least we know where we're starting from. So I think it's important for the individuals to have some sense about where they are in their careers and how they want their careers to fit into this larger thing called their lives, right? So we're sort of on equal footing in terms of I'm evaluating you and you're evaluating me.
Do you, if someone says that it's a stepping stone, it's almost as if they want that Harvard degree, they want that New York Times brand on their CV. Is that fine? Like, if someone's honest with you about that, is that like, okay, well, at least I know where you stand? Or is that a turnoff based on your values?
I mean, I think it's all dependent on what role are you applying for. I mean, if someone's coming in and, I actually want to be XYZ and this is going to help me improve my craft and here's how I think I can add value while I'm also extracting value. If you're able to articulate both sides of that coin for me, that's great. Like now we know where each of us stands. If you come across as a blood-sucking pariah, well, here's what I think the Times can do for me. Well, that's a problem, right? Potentially. Um, so I just think for me, it's the candor and transparency so that we know what we're dealing with here. And it doesn't stop at the point of entry. It's also, my colleagues will tell you I'm fond of saying treat people like adults, right? So do you endeavor to have an individual contributor role, or do you actually want to lead teams to some discernible outcome and success? Like in institutions, we just sort of make the assumption that everybody wants a career path that starts off individual, and I get a team and I get promoted. You got to leave room though for people who are like, I'm a domain expert. I don't have ambitions to run a big team. I want to do this work to the best of my ability. I want you to give me the tools to do that. But I don't have the sort of traditional up ambition. And when you make room for that person, but these kinds of outcomes require very transparent adult conversations. Like, these are the needs of the institutions. What are your ambitions? Can we find a match?
I love that. Do you have any, maybe for people looking for work out there, any interesting stories of how someone stood out?
I'll tell you a funny story, and I'm only telling it to you not to brag, but because you'll see why. So a bunch of years ago, I was in an interview where I was asked, sort of what was then. I don't know if people still ask. We certainly don't ask it. Like, how would people describe you, right? And I always just think I thought then, I think even more so now because I'm getting older and more crotchety, and I'm like, that's a weird question. Like, how much time should anybody be spending thinking about what other people think about them? So, right. And so I said, give me a minute. And I picked up my cell phone and I posted on Facebook, quick, give me one word to describe me. And I said, I've just asked some people. Let's go to the next question and then we can come back. Make a long story short, I was not a fit for this job, but I did a few minutes later come back and read some of the responses. And I look back on that now, and I think that was a lot of moxie.
I know, I kind of love it though.
I tell that story to say, be spontaneous to the moment, be present, and don't meet the moment with your pat answer. Lean into what's really happening. Always answer the question, but to the extent you feel like there's more to say, answer the question and then say that. But you didn't ask this, but I'd like to add this because I think it's important. I mean, if you're presenting yourself as a generic brand of whatever, where am I going to discern value in that?
Right.
So go into every situation thinking, how am I going to demonstrate my ability to add value to this institution? That should be the basis or the anchor of how you show up.
Tell me about the hardest part of your job.
So I'm fondly referred to human resources as being stewards of the institution as well as ambassadors of the employee experience. And so we've got to find that middle ground between what the institution needs and what employees want. So that sounds easy to say, but it's very difficult.
Very, very hard. Yeah.
Right? Right. Because everybody thinks no one comes to work thinking they're being unreasonable. But you'll get someone that comes and they have a very specific, well, why don't you offer XYZ benefit? And I've got to figure out how to articulate well because it's fringe. One, and then two, like there are all these there are all kinds of reasons why we might not offer something, but having to say no to a person who's highly invested in their very personal experience is hard because it's not always rational. So that's one that I'm not particularly fond of. And I just had this conversation with someone, not who works here, but someone I mentor who works at a different institution and recently had to lay off two people. And she's like, I just feel horrible. And I said to her, at whatever point you don't feel something after having to let someone go, your heart's gone dark. It should never be easy to do, even when the person deserves it. I mean, I have fired people where you just go, seriously, like, you shouldn't have done that. And even in those circumstances, a part of you, because people, you've taken away a person's ability to support themselves and presumably a family, right? And that's hard. It should be hard.
Should be hard. Yeah. Let me ask you another question. What is the best part about your job?
I did a talk a few months ago, and in the talk recommended a book called Quiet it's a really lovely book, and it really talks about how difficult it is to be an introvert in an extroverted world. One of my favorite books to recommend to people. And the young woman in the audience got on my calendar, having read the book. She came so buttoned up. You would have thought I was interviewing her. She's like, thank you so much for your time. I read the book. I have these questions. I'd like your advice and blah, blah, blah. I was so blown away. And so we chatted for whatever the time allotment was. And she was really sort of like, can you coach me on how I get my next job? And blah, 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 blah. And we talked about her approaches, this, that, and the other thing. She just came to visit with me. It was 8 months since or 6 or 7 months. I can't remember, something like this. But she's come back and she's since been promoted.
Oh, wow. That's awesome.
I am always giving away free advice. Like, again, back to the economy of it's for someone, just give it away, right? I can count the number of times people have come back to say, hey, you gave me this advice, and let me tell you how it all unfolded. And when it's good news, best feeling in the world. For someone to have taken the time, one, to seek you out for your expertise, take your advice, and then come to close the loop with you, best part. Love that every time it happens.
I feel like I mentor people that never take my advice, to be honest with you.
but that is learning. They are learning.
How would you describe your leadership philosophy if you had to describe it? And additional question to that, has it evolved or is it always evolving? But how would you describe your philosophy to leadership?
So I'm going to take that away because that feels like something I should have some thought about. But what immediately leaps to mind is, one, treat people like adults. Like, I believe that in every interaction. Like, just go with the assumption that the person is an adult until they prove differently, right? And for me, that means being transparent, owning your position, being curious about the other position if it's not the same as yours. Like, there's a whole bunch of things under this category called treat people like adults would be one. And the second thing I would say, and Meredith Kopit-Levian, who's president and CEO here at the Times and who I have the good pleasure to work for and with, demonstrates this. Meredith has 100% confidence in what she knows, and she has equal confidence in what she doesn't know. And how that shows up is she'll say, I have an opinion or a point of view, but XYZ expert, you're the expert, weigh in, come in behind me and clean up what I might have missed. And I think as a leader, that is just amazing to just have that level of confidence in what you know and have it show up in what you don't know, and being able to look at your experts and say, you're on. I endeavor to model that.
And I think also being vulnerable enough to not act like you have all the answers, because I think that's a big foil in leadership, which I think when I was much earlier in my career, I was really bad at that.
And I'm going to let you off the hook a little bit. I think all of us earlier in our career, there wasn't as much, one, at stake, and then two, there wasn't as much to not know. I mean, who today can be an expert in everything? It's impossible. It's just not possible.
This is a question I have to ask. It might feel like an old question, but how has the pandemic affected your industry in what you do in human resources? And do you think those effects are permanent?
Hmm. That's a delicious question. Um, so I'll say a couple of things. One, it's hard for me to think about the pandemic in isolation because it was the pandemic. It was on the heels or back of the murder of George Floyd. It was an uprising of civil rights we haven't seen since the 60s. And it was the beginning of the most divisive political environment I've lived through. So the assault on the average person was multi-directional and intense in equal proportion. So it's hard to talk about just COVID for me because I all these things happen simultaneously. And as an HR professional, I spent the first year of the pandemic still employed at Freddie Mac. So I have a place where I had already been installed and then a new place, which is also a nuanced experience. And I will tell you, over the course of my multi-decade human resources experience, I have never seen the demand for HR presence like I have since the trifecta.
It became more important.
Oh, every single person in the building would be like, "Where's HR?" And all of a sudden, we became experts on trauma. We became experts on, viruses and experts on, all kinds of things that hitherto no one would ask our opinion. So to answer the last part of your question, I don't think it's going to abate. I think it one has demonstrated, if you're really thoughtful, how you might maximize your human resources function. And I think that's a permanent sort of indent on the perception of HR and what it can do. More broadly, though, I will tell you, I have a long, lingering concern that we have underappreciated and under rotated on. I don't think people are well. I mean, I think that people are still, even if are not consciously aware of it, people are still feeling the impacts of the height of those three things converging. And you know, mental health to me is like the place that we have to anchor, and not just in May during Mental Health Awareness Month. And we need to be thinking about programmatically year round, how are we checking in on the well being of the people who work for us? And what are we doing to support that well being that goes beyond EAP?
Do you have a mantra or a quote that you always think about?
I always think about how can I leave people and things better than I found them. That's my endeavor
I love that.
every day. Yep. And it's particularly helpful when it's something crappy. Because I'm like, okay, anchor into like, how do you make it better? You can lament how bad it is, or you can think about how do you make it better?
That's great. Going back to the treat people like adults, our head of talent has this phrase which I always think about, which is clear is kind. I always think about that when I'm having one of those critical conversations. You sometimes want to take the sugar coated or take the easy way out.
Hmm.
That idea of clear is kind, I always think about when it relates to conversations with talent. And I think treat people like adults is kind of another way to say that, I think.
There's a member of my senior most team who says that all the time. Clarity is kindness. They must be related. My person and your person.
Yeah, probably are. All right. Now we're going to switch gears and talk about something that's inspired you recently. So I'll go first so you can kind of gather your thoughts. But mine is I think the world right now is pretty broken, I think. And the Olympics, I just love because it's, 206 countries coming together. And I feel like the perfect time, the world needs the Olympics right now. That's something that's inspiring me to sort of stop all the politicking that's happening and kind of stop and see the world watching
Hmm.
together. I don't know why. I always love the Olympics.
Oh, I love that too.
Do you have anything that is inspiring you?
I witnessed something a couple of weeks ago that is still sort of occupying space in my mind. So to set the scene, the headquarters of the New York Times is here in Midtown, 8th Avenue, 40th Street and 8th Avenue, right across the street from Port Authority. 8th Avenue, For those of you who do not know, Manhattan is unsavory. You see all kinds of things on 8th Avenue that you're not necessarily writing home about if you're a tourist. So I usually will walk always actually, from the office to the train station because I train back and forth between New York and DC. So imagine it. I'm walking down South on 8th to get to Moynihan train station. And there is a man in a wheelchair, disheveled, probably unhoused, and he's sort of rolling along in this wheelchair. And it looks like he's about to topple out of it because he hits an uneven part of the pavement. And right beside him, standing in front of a storefront, is a member of the NYPD, who steps forward and says, "You all right, bruh?" And the guy's like, "Yeah, I'm fine." And he rolls off, and the police officer and I make eye contact. And I was like, I just couldn't control myself. And I was like, that was beautiful because he literally was ready to like lay hands and help this man get upright in this wheelchair. And it was so beautiful because he didn't think about it. It was instinctual. He was going to help.
Mm.
And he saw me and I saw him and I said, that was beautiful. And he covered his heart and bowed his head. And I went on and it was just such a beautiful moment of like, at the end of the day, we're all humans with an instinct to be kind and to be thoughtful. It's NYPD. I grew up here. I have a love-hate relationship with, police departments, generally speaking, for lots of reasons. But in that moment, it was a human being seeing another human being in duress and just instinctively moved in to help. And it's weeks later and I still think of it. And it's like,
that's such a great New York moment.
It was a great New York moment. Beautifully said.
No one's above you. No one's below you. We're all at the same level, Again, captures that philosophy really well, I think. Is there a lesson that you've learned recently? Mine is be careful that the things you own don't end up owning you. My lesson recently, because when you get caught up in having things, they end up overpowering and taking your time and taking your energy. And I don't know, it made me want to kind of simplify my life a little bit.
Yeah, it's so interesting that you would say that. My oldest son, who just recently turned 18, his big thing is like, let's not complicate this. He's always looking for like, what's the easiest solution to all this? And it's a little bit of what you're saying in terms of like, just keep it simple so that you can enjoy the fullness of your life. It's beautiful. That same child, so I have two children, the 18-year-old that I just mentioned and a 14-year-old. And the 18-year-old is accepted and is going to Syracuse in the fall.
Congratulations.
Thank you very much. The 14-year-old will be in high school in the fall. And so as a parent, the thing that I'm living, and I say this to younger people, when you have children, there are these years where it just seems like one of my girlfriends once said this, it's the days are long, but the years are fast. And you don't really appreciate that when you're going through the long days. You're like, I just want to go to sleep. But then one day, the 18-year-old turned 18 on a Sunday and graduated high school on that following Tuesday. And I literally was like, that's the fastest 18 years on record. Like, how did that happen? And I don't remember the long days when it's like, the baby's not sleeping. I don't remember any of that. And so I'm saying all that. It's been a really magnificent time for its reminder to relish the days. Like, just relish every moment that you have an opportunity to just sort of like relish what's happening. Do it because it all goes by like this. People say that because it's true.
I like that idea, though, because the days are long, but the years are short.
We're halfway through 2024, my friend. In a minute, I'll be calling you to say, like, Happy New Year. Didn't we just do that?
I know. You got to savor, and you got to be present.
That's the lesson. Be present. That really is the big picture. Like, just be present to the moment. Yeah.
All right. Our last question for this podcast is we'd like to double dog dare the audience to do something. Mine is I want people, this is because I'm doing this roadshow next week and it's top of mind. I'm thinking about the company and reigniting our culture, is to Set higher expectations for people around you. And that's what I'm trying to do. Try to set higher expectations within reason. That's mine. Do you have a double dog dare for our audience?
It's interesting. You've steered me. Thank you for that steady stare. What I would say, because, we're at the point now where presumably people are having mid-year performance reviews.
Yeah.
I would say for every individual to have a clear articulation of where they want to most deploy or most intensely deploy their skills or talents and ambitions for the remainder of the year. Like, you've got your goals and you should be prepared to say, here's where I am with my goals. I'm going to make this one. I'm not going to make this one. I need your help in this way, blah, 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 blah. But on top of that, if there's something that you've noticed or something that you think someone should do this, someone should ideate around this, someone should spin up a working group on this, like, what's that thing where you think, I uniquely have a point of view of how we might advance the ball on this or introduce an idea or whatever. Use the mid-year to make a bold declaration of, here is where I think I can have a positive impact on the institution, my body of work, like whatever the scope of what your thought is. Do that.
I like that. So you're daring, because it's the mid-year review time, is kind of aim higher, aim bigger.
Mm-hmm. What's that big idea you haven't articulated? What's that observation that you think is being unattended? Like, you've got your immediate supervisor's undivided attention for whatever that period of the review is. Use it. It's valuable real estate.
Well, this has been a valuable conversation. Thanks for your time and
thank you.
Your generosity and all your ideas. And we appreciate you being on the podcast.
Thank you for the invitation. This has been really, really fun. Thank you.
Soul and Science is a Mekanism podcast produced by Maggie Bowles, Ryan Tillotson, and Lily Jablonski. The show is edited by Daniel Ferreira with theme music by Kyle Merritt. And I'm your host, Jason Harris.